The morning sun painted the sky orange as Sarah Martinez adjusted her red pilot's jacket. Her friends called her Red Falcon because of her quick thinking and the bright red jacket she always wore during flights. She had been flying for 12 years. But today felt different somehow. Sarah worked for Mountain Air Rescue, a small company that helped people in remote areas. Her helicopter was old, but reliable, painted white with a red cross on the side. She had saved many lives over the years, pulling injured hikers from mountains and rushing sick people to hospitals. That Tuesday morning, Sarah was drinking coffee in the hangar when her radio crackled to life. "Red Falcon, we have an emergency," came the voice of dispatch operator Mike. His voice sounded worried, which was unusual. Mike had worked dispatch for 20 years and rarely showed emotion. "What's the situation, Mike?" Sarah asked, setting down her coffee cup. She could hear the urgency in his voice and felt her heart rate increase. "There's been a landslide up at Pine Ridge Camp. It's a summer camp for kids. The main road is completely blocked, and we're getting reports that the secondary access road is starting to crack. Weather Service says another storm is coming in fast." Sarah knew Pine Ridge Camp well. It sat in a valley surrounded by steep hills, about 40 miles north of the city. The camp housed 70 children aged 8 to 16, plus 10 adult counselors and staff. It was a beautiful location, but the recent heavy rains had made the area unstable. "How bad is the landslide?" Sarah asked, already moving toward her helicopter. "Bad enough that the road crews say it'll take at least 3 days to clear. But here's the real problem. The weather report shows a massive storm system moving in. If those kids are still there when it hits, the whole valley could flood." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that valley, and she knew what heavy rain could do to it. The camp sat near a river that could rise quickly during storms. If the children couldn't get out by road, they would be trapped. "What about other helicopters? Can we get a fleet up there?" she asked. Mike's voice grew quieter. "That's the problem, Sarah. The other 2 rescue helicopters are both down for maintenance. The military has birds, but they're all committed to a training exercise 200 miles away. It would take hours to get them back." Sarah looked at her helicopter. It was a medium-sized aircraft that could carry maybe 8 people safely, 10 if she pushed it. 70 children plus 10 adults meant 80 people total. Even with multiple trips, it would be nearly impossible to evacuate everyone before the storm hit. "When is the storm expected to reach the camp?" she asked. "Weather Service says 6 hours, maybe 7 if we're lucky." "But Sarah, even if you started right now, you couldn't make enough trips. The math just doesn't work." Sarah stared at her helicopter, her mind racing. Mike was right about the numbers. Even if each trip took only 30 minutes, she would need at least 10 trips to get everyone out. That would take 5 hours, not counting refueling time or any delays. And weather could change quickly in the mountains. But as she stood there, Sarah thought about those 70 children. She imagined their faces, their families waiting at home. She thought about the counselors who had dedicated their summer to taking care of these kids. She couldn't just abandon them. "Mike, I need you to do me a favor," she said, walking around her helicopter to check it one more time. "What do you need?" "Call the camp and tell them I'm coming. Tell them to gather everyone in the main lodge and be ready to move fast. Also, call the hospital and tell them to have medical teams standing by just in case." "Sarah, you know the numbers don't work. Even if you fly perfectly, you can't get them all out in time." Sarah climbed into her helicopter and started the engine. The familiar sound of the rotors spinning up filled the hangar. She had made her decision, even though she wasn't sure how she would pull it off. "Maybe not," she said into her headset, "but I have to try. Those kids are counting on someone to help them, and right now, I'm the only option they have." As Sarah lifted off from the hangar, she looked at the clock on her instrument panel. It was 9:15 a.m. The storm was expected to hit around 3 o'clock p.m. She had less than 6 hours to figure out how to save 80 people with one helicopter. The mountains stretched out below her as she flew north, toward Pine Ridge Camp. She had no idea how she was going to do it, but she knew she had to find a way. Failure wasn't an option when children's lives were at stake. The flight to Pine Ridge Camp took 25 minutes through winding mountain valleys. As Sarah flew, she could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The storm looked even worse than the weather reports had suggested. She had maybe 5 hours before those clouds reached the camp. When Pine Ridge Camp came into view, Sarah's heart sank. The landslide was massive. Tons of rock, mud, and fallen trees had completely buried the main road. She could see where the secondary road was cracking, with chunks of asphalt hanging over a steep drop. It was clear that no ground vehicles would be getting in or out anytime soon. The camp itself looked peaceful from the air. Children were playing in the central courtyard, their colorful t-shirts making them look like tiny flowers scattered across the green grass. They didn't seem to understand the danger they were in. Sarah could see counselors gathering the kids together, probably explaining the situation. She landed her helicopter in the camp's sports field, a flat area that served as the only suitable landing zone. As the rotors slowed down, she was surrounded by curious children and worried-looking adults. "Are you here to rescue us?" asked a small girl with pigtails. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Before Sarah could answer, a tall man with a beard approached. He wore a camp director's badge that read Tom Wilson. "You must be the pilot they told us about," Tom said, shaking Sarah's hand. "I'm grateful you came, but I have to ask, how exactly are we going to get 80 people out of here in one helicopter?" Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her. The children seemed excited about the helicopter, but the adults looked worried. She could see the fear in Tom's eyes, even though he was trying to stay calm for the kids. "I'm working on that," Sarah said. "First, I need to know exactly how many people we have and their ages. Are there any injuries? Anyone who can't walk?" Tom pulled out a clipboard. 70 children, ranging from 8 to 16 years old, 10 adults, including myself. Everyone is healthy and mobile. But the youngest kids weigh about 60 pounds, and the teenagers are closer to 140 pounds. Sarah did quick math in her head. Her helicopter could safely carry about 1,200 pounds of passengers, plus herself. With fuel, equipment, and safety margins, she could maybe take 8 to 10 people per trip, if they were mostly children. "Tom, I need you to organize the kids by age and weight. Smallest ones first. And I need all the adults to help keep everyone calm and organized." As Tom started organizing the children, Sarah walked back to her helicopter to check fuel levels and call dispatch. She had about 4 hours of flying time worth of fuel, which meant she could make maybe 7 or 8 trips before needing to refuel. "Mike, this is Red Falcon. I'm at the camp now. How does it look?" Mike's voice crackled through the radio. "The landslide is worse than I thought, but the kids are all safe for now. I'm going to start evacuating the smallest ones first. I need you to coordinate with the hospital and make sure we have people ready to receive passengers." "Sarah, I've been running the numbers. Even with perfect conditions, you can't get everyone out before that storm hits." Sarah looked at the children playing nearby. Some were laughing and treating the whole thing like an adventure. Others looked scared and kept asking when their parents would come get them. "Then I'll have to find another way," she said. Sarah spent the next hour carefully planning each trip. She weighed groups of children and calculated exactly how many she could safely carry. The math was tight, but if everything went perfectly, she might be able to get everyone out. Her first trip carried 8 of the youngest children. They were excited about flying in a helicopter, chattering and pressing their faces against the windows. Sarah flew them to the nearest hospital, where parents were already waiting. The relief on their faces when they saw their children was something Sarah would never forget. The second trip went just as smoothly. 10 more children safely delivered. But as she flew back to the camp for the third trip, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach drop. The storm clouds were moving faster than predicted. What had looked like 5 hours of clear weather was now looking more like 3 hours. She radioed Mike with the bad news. "The storm is moving faster. I've got maybe 3 hours now, not 5. Sarah, you need to consider the possibility that you might not get everyone out. Maybe you should focus on getting as many kids as possible and leave some of the adults." The suggestion made Sarah angry. She wasn't going to abandon anyone, adult or child. But as she landed for her third trip, she realized Mike was right about one thing at her current pace. She wouldn't get everyone out in time. Tom approached her as she landed. "The weather's getting worse, isn't it?" he said. It wasn't really a question. Sarah nodded. "We're running out of time. I need to make a decision that could put everyone at risk." "What kind of decision?" Sarah looked at her helicopter, then at the 80 people depending on her. "I can either keep making safe trips and leave some people behind, or I can overload the helicopter and try to get everyone out. But overloading means, if something goes wrong, we all go down together." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Around them, children were playing while adults tried to keep them calm. Nobody else knew how desperate the situation had become. "What would you do if these were your own kids?" Tom asked. Sarah thought about her own family, about the risks she took every day as a rescue pilot. She thought about the oath she had taken when she became a pilot, to put the safety of others before her own. "I'd risk everything to save them," she said quietly. Tom nodded. "Then that's what we'll do. Whatever you decide, we trust you." As Sarah prepared for her 4th trip, she knew she was about to make the most dangerous decision of her flying career. The storm was closing in, and conventional wisdom said she should play it safe. But 80 lives hung in the balance, and sometimes being a hero meant ignoring conventional wisdom. Sarah's 4th trip carried 12 children instead of her usual 8. The helicopter felt heavy as it lifted off, and she could hear the engine working harder than normal. But they made it safely to the hospital. As she helped the children out, she could see the storm clouds getting closer. Lightning flickered in the distance. During the flight back to camp, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't keep making normal trips. There simply wasn't enough time. She would have to push her helicopter beyond its recommended limits if she wanted to save everyone. She called Mike on the radio. "I'm changing the plan. I'm going to start taking larger groups." "Sarah, that's dangerous. If you overload that aircraft in this weather..." "I know the risks, Mike, but if I don't take risks, people are going to die. I need you to trust me on this." There was a long pause. Finally, Mike's voice came back, quieter than before. "I trust you, Red Falcon. Just ... Be careful." When Sarah landed at the camp for her 5th trip, the wind was already picking up. She could see Tom organizing the remaining children into groups. There were still about 50 people left to evacuate. "Tom, we're running out of time," Sarah called out as she shut down the engine. "I need to start taking bigger groups. It's going to be risky." Tom looked at the darkening sky. The first drops of rain were starting to fall. "How risky?" "I'm going to load 15 people instead of 8 or 10. My helicopter wasn't designed to carry that much weight, especially in bad weather. But it's our only chance to get everyone out." Tom gathered the remaining counselors and explained the situation. They would have to trust Sarah's judgment and help keep the children calm during what might be very difficult flights. Sarah spent precious minutes recalculating weight distribution and fuel consumption. She would have to fly lower and slower, which was dangerous in the mountains. She would also have to reduce her fuel load to make room for the extra passengers, which meant she couldn't make any mistakes or waste time. The 5th trip carried 15 people, 12 children, and 3 counselors. The helicopter struggled to lift off, and Sarah could feel how different it handled with the extra weight. Every turn required more effort. Every climb took longer, but they made it to the hospital safely. On the flight back, the rain started coming down harder. Sarah had to fly around several storm cells, which used up precious fuel and time. When she landed at the camp, there were 35 people left, mostly older teenagers and the remaining adults. "This is it," Sarah told Tom as she calculated her final loads. 2 more trips, and we're done. But these are going to be the hardest ones." The wind was now strong enough to rock the helicopter even when it was on the ground. Sarah could see trees bending in the distance. The storm was almost on top of them. For her 6th trip, Sarah loaded 18 people into a helicopter designed for 10. She had never carried so much weight before, and she wasn't sure the aircraft could handle it. The older teenagers were heavier than the younger children, and the adults weighed even more. As she started the engine, Sarah could feel the helicopter struggling. The rotors turned slower than usual, and it took much longer to build up enough power for takeoff. When she finally lifted off, The aircraft felt sluggish and unresponsive. Halfway to the hospital, they hit the edge of the storm. Wind gusts rocked the helicopter violently from side to side. Rain pounded against the windows so hard that Sarah could barely see where she was going. She had to grip the controls tightly to keep the aircraft steady. "Is everything okay?" shouted one of the teenagers over the noise of the storm. "Everything's fine," Sarah shouted back, even though she wasn't sure it was true. The helicopter was handling unlike anything she had ever experienced. Every gust of wind threatened to push them off course or into the mountains, but somehow they made it. As Sarah helped the passengers out at the hospital, her hands were shaking from the strain of fighting the controls. She had one more trip to make, the most dangerous one yet. The flight back to camp was a nightmare. The storm was now in full force, with rain coming down in sheets and wind gusts that made the helicopter bounce like a toy. Sarah could barely see the landing zone at the camp through the rain and darkness. When she finally touched down, 17 people were waiting for her, the last group that needed to be evacuated. These were the remaining adults and the oldest, heaviest teenagers. It would be the most weight she had ever attempted to carry. Tom ran up to her helicopter, soaked from the rain. "Sarah, maybe we should wait. This storm is getting really bad." Sarah looked around at the 17 people waiting to be rescued. Behind them, she could see water starting to flow down from the hills. The flooding was beginning, just as the weather service had predicted. "There's no time to wait," she shouted over the storm. "If we don't go now, the valley will flood and we'll all be trapped." As the last 17 people climbed into her helicopter, Sarah knew she was about to attempt something that went against everything she had learned about safe flying. The aircraft was now carrying more than twice its recommended passenger load in the worst weather conditions she had ever seen. But as she looked at the faces around her, teenagers scared for their lives, counselors who had dedicated their summer to caring for children, Tom, who had trusted her with everyone's safety, Sarah knew she had no choice. She started the engine and began what would either be the most heroic rescue of her career or the last flight she would ever make. The helicopter groaned under the weight of 17 passengers. Sarah had never heard her aircraft make sounds like this before. The engine strained as she tried to lift off, and for a terrifying moment, she thought they might not get airborne at all. Slowly, impossibly, the overloaded helicopter rose into the storm, but it handled like a truck instead of an aircraft. Every control input took twice as much effort, and the aircraft responded sluggishly to her commands. Sarah had to use all her strength just to keep them level. The wind hit them immediately. A powerful gust caught the helicopter and threw it sideways toward the trees. Sarah fought the controls, pulling them back on course just in time. Behind her, she could hear some of the passengers crying or praying. "Everyone stay calm," Sarah shouted over the noise of the storm and the struggling engine. "We're going to make it." But privately, Sarah wasn't sure they would. The helicopter was flying at its absolute limits, and they still had to navigate through mountain valleys in zero visibility conditions. One mistake, one equipment failure, one unexpected wind gust, and they would all crash. The rain was so heavy that Sarah couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. She had to fly entirely by instruments, following her GPS, and hoping there were no obstacles in their path. The helicopter bucked and rolled in the wind, making several passengers sick. 10 minutes into the flight, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood run cold, a grinding noise from the engine. The aircraft was working so hard to carry the extra weight that something was starting to fail. "What was that noise?" asked Tom, who was sitting in the co-pilot seat. "Nothing to worry about," Sarah lied. She knew exactly what that noise meant. The engine was overheating from the strain, and if it failed now, they would crash into the mountains below. Sarah made a quick decision. She reduced power slightly and started descending, trading altitude for reduced engine strain. It was risky flying lower in the mountains, but it might keep the engine from failing completely. The grinding noise continued, getting worse with each passing minute. Sarah watched her engine temperature gauge climb into the red zone. She had never seen it that high before. At any moment, the engine could seize up completely.
How much farther?
Asked one of the teenagers. Just a few more minutes, Sarah said, though she wasn't sure the engine would last that long. Then, through the rain and wind, Sarah saw something that gave her hope: the lights of the hospital in the distance. They were almost there. The engine temperature was still climbing. But if they could just hold together for another few minutes... The helicopter shuddered as another strong wind gust hit them. This one was so powerful that it tilted the aircraft almost sideways. Sarah had to use all her strength to level them out, and she heard several passengers scream. "I can see the hospital," Tom said, pointing through the windscreen. But as they approached the landing zone, Sarah realized they had one more problem. The wind was now so strong that landing safely would be nearly impossible, especially with the helicopter as overloaded as it was. She would have to time her approach perfectly. The first landing attempt failed. A wind gust caught them just as they were about to touch down, pushing them sideways across the landing pad. Sarah had to pull up quickly to avoid hitting a light pole. "Sarah, we need to get down," Tom said urgently. "I think some of the kids are getting really scared." Sarah could hear crying from the passenger compartment. The violent motion of the helicopter in the storm was terrifying the younger passengers. But she also knew that rushing the landing could kill them all. She circled around for a second approach. The engine temperature was now well into the danger zone, and the grinding noise was getting louder. Sarah knew she might not get a third chance. As she lined up for landing, Sarah said a silent prayer. She had pushed her helicopter far beyond its limits, carried more people than should have been possible, flown through weather that would have grounded most pilots. Now everything came down to this one landing. The wind tried to push them off course again, but this time Sarah was ready for it. She compensated with the controls, fighting to keep them lined up with the landing pad. 50 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet... The helicopter touched down hard on the hospital landing pad, bouncing once before settling. Sarah immediately shut down the engine to prevent any damage from overheating. Steam rose from the engine compartment as the hot metal cooled in the rain. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Tom started laughing, not from humor, but from relief. "We made it," he said. "We actually made it." Sarah sat back in her seat, her hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Through the rain-streaked windows, she could see hospital staff running toward them with wheelchairs and medical equipment. Parents were already gathering, desperate to be reunited with their children, as the 17 passengers climbed out of the helicopter. Sarah did a quick count in her head. 70 children plus 10 adults. 80 people total. Every single person from Pine Ridge Camp was now safe. But as she watched the last passenger disappear into the hospital, Sarah realized her own ordeal wasn't over yet. Her helicopter was damaged, possibly beyond repair. The engine might never run again after being pushed so hard. And there were questions that would need to be answered about her decision to overload the aircraft. However, she sat in the cockpit listening to the storm rage outside. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had risked everything to save 80 people, and it had worked. Whatever happened next, she would always know that when it mattered most, she had made the right choice. The hospital lobby was chaos in the best possible way. Parents were crying as they hugged their children. Medical staff were checking everyone over. Reporters were starting to arrive after hearing about the dramatic rescue. Sarah stood near a window, watching the storm continue to rage outside. Dr. Lisa Chen, the hospital's chief of emergency medicine, approached Sarah with a cup of coffee. "You look like you could use this," she said. "Thanks," Sarah said, accepting the warm cup gratefully. Her hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "I've been doing this for 15 years, Dr. Chen said, and I've never seen anything like what you did today. Flying in that weather with that many people. It should have been impossible." Sarah sipped her coffee and watched through the window as rain pounded the glass. Sometimes impossible is the only option you have. Mike from dispatch appeared in the lobby, soaked from running through the rain from the parking lot. He spotted Sarah and hurried over. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, his expression serious. Dr. Chen excused herself, leaving Sarah and Mike alone. Sarah could tell from Mike's face that something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked. "I just got a call from the Federal Aviation Administration. They want to see you first thing Monday morning. Someone reported that you were flying overweight in dangerous conditions. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had known this was coming, but she had hoped she would have more time before facing the consequences of her actions. She asked. Probably someone at the hospital who knows aircraft regulations. Look, Sarah, what you did today was incredible, but it was also completely against every safety rule in the book. The FAA has to investigate. Sarah nodded. She understood the situation. Pilots who violated safety regulations could lose their licenses even if they had good reasons for doing so. The FAA's job was to ensure aviation safety. And they couldn't make exceptions just because someone was trying to save lives. If they take my license, will you make sure someone tells those kids what really happened? I don't want them to think I was just being reckless. Before Mike could answer, Tom Wilson appeared beside them. He had been talking to parents and reporters, and he looked exhausted but relieved. Hey, Sarah. There are some people who want to meet you, he said. Tom led them to a quiet conference room where several parents were waiting. Sarah recognized some of them from the landing pad. They had been the first to arrive when she started bringing children to safety. We wanted to thank you personally, said a woman Sarah didn't know. I'm Jennifer Martinez, no relation, despite the name. My daughter Emma was in your first group of rescues. Other parents stepped forward, sharing their stories. They talked about how scared they had been when they heard about the landslide, how desperate they felt waiting at the hospital, and how grateful they were when they saw Sarah's red helicopter bringing their children to safety. We heard someone is questioning what you did today, said a man whose son had been in the final. Most dangerous flight. We want you to know that every parent here supports you completely. You saved our children when no one else could. Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had been so focused on the technical aspects of the rescue and the potential consequences that she hadn't fully processed the emotional impact of what had happened. We've talked to the media, another parent said. Everyone is going to know that you're a hero. The FAA investigation doesn't change that. As the parents continued to thank her, Sarah began to understand something important. Yes, she had broken safety regulations. Yes, she might face consequences for her actions. But she had also saved 80 lives. That was something no investigation could take away. Later that evening, Sarah finally had a chance to inspect her helicopter. The aircraft was still sitting on the hospital landing pad, rain streaming off its damaged rotors. A team of mechanics had already begun examining the engine. How bad is it? She asked the lead mechanic. Pretty bad, he admitted. The engine is shot from the overheating. The transmission is damaged from the excess weight. This bird won't fly again without major repairs. Sarah ran her hand along the helicopter's red and white paint. This aircraft had been her partner for thousands of hours of flying. They had saved dozens of lives together over the years. Now it might be permanently grounded because of one day's decisions. But, the mechanic continued, I've been working on helicopters for 20 years, and I've never seen one push this hard and still get everyone home safely. Whatever you did today, you did it right. As Sarah walked back toward the hospital, she thought about what lay ahead. There would be investigations, paperwork, and possibly the end of her flying career. But there would also be 70 children who would grow up to have families of their own, 10 counselors who would return to their lives, and dozens of families who would remain complete. The storm was finally starting to pass. Through the breaking clouds, Sarah could see stars beginning to appear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, 80 people were safe because of the choice she had made to risk everything. Sarah pulled her red jacket tighter around her shoulders and headed inside to face whatever came next. She was still the Red Falcon, and no matter what happened, she would always know that when it mattered most, she had chosen to put others before herself. 3 months later, Sarah sat in a conference room at the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters. Across from her sat 3 investigators, a pile of reports, and the future of her flying career. The investigation had been thorough and fair, but Sarah knew that breaking safety regulations typically meant the end of a pilot's license. Ms. Martinez, said the lead investigator, we've completed our review of the Pine Ridge Camp incident, Your actions that day violated multiple federal aviation regulations regarding aircraft weight limits and weather minimums. Sarah nodded. She had known this moment would come. I understand, sir. However, the investigator continued. We've also reviewed testimony from the passengers, weather data from that day, an expert analysis of your flight path and decision-making process. He opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. The National Transportation Safety Board has concluded that your actions, while technically in violation of regulations, were justified by the extraordinary circumstances you faced. No reasonable pilot could have saved all 80 people while following standard procedures. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. This wasn't what she had expected to hear. The FAA has decided to issue you a formal reprimand rather than suspend your license. However, you will be required to complete additional safety training and undergo a psychological evaluation to ensure you can make sound decisions under pressure. Sarah could barely believe what she was hearing. She would keep her license. She could continue flying, continue saving lives. There's one more thing, the investigator said, sliding a final document across the table. The Department of Transportation has nominated you for the Gold Medal for Exceptional Service, the highest civilian aviation award. The ceremony is next month. When Sarah walked out of the FAA building, she found a crowd of people waiting for her. Tom Wilson was there, along with many of the parents and children from Pine Ridge Camp. They had traveled from across the country to support her during the hearing. How did it go? Asked Tom. Sarah held up the document, confirming she could keep her license. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Children who had been scared passengers 3 months ago were now running up to hug her, thanking her again for saving their lives. Sarah, said Emma, the 9-year-old with pigtails who had asked if she was there to rescue them. My mom says you're famous now. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level. I'm not famous, sweetheart. I just did my job. But you saved all of us, Emma said. That makes you a hero. It's looking around at all the faces, children who were growing taller, parents who still got emotional when they talked about that day. Counselors who had returned to their normal lives. Sarah realized Emma was right, not because of the medal or the news stories, but because she had made a choice to put others before herself when it mattered most. 6 months after the rescue, Sarah was back in her helicopter, a new one. Since her old aircraft had been too damaged to repair, she was flying medical supplies to a remote mountain village when her radio crackled. Red Falcon, this is dispatch. We have a situation. Sarah smiled at the familiar call. Mike was still working dispatch, and the nickname had stuck. What do you need, Mike? Small plane down in the national forest. 2 people on board? Conditions are marginal for flying. Sarah looked at her instrument panel, then at the weather outside. It wasn't the best flying weather, but it wasn't the worst she had seen either. More importantly, 2 people were depending on someone to help them. I'm on my way, she said, turning her helicopter toward the forest as she flew toward the crash site. Sarah thought about how much had changed since Pine Ridge Camp. She had been featured in magazines, interviewed on television, and asked to speak at aviation conferences. But the most important change was internal. She had learned that being a hero wasn't about seeking glory or recognition. It was about making difficult choices when other people needed help. It was about being willing to risk everything when lives were at stake. It was about doing the right thing even when it was dangerous or could cost you everything you had worked for. The crash site came into view below her. Sarah could see the small plane tangled in the trees and 2 people waving for help. She began looking for a place to land. Running through her mental checklist of safety procedures and risk assessments, but she also remembered something else. Sometimes the safe choice isn't the right choice. Sometimes being a hero means pushing beyond. What's safe or reasonable, because human lives are worth more than rules and regulations. Sarah had learned that lesson on a stormy day when she chose to save 80 people instead of following the rulebook. She had become known as the Red Falcon who risked it all to save children from certain death. But more than that, she had become someone who understood that the most important decisions in life aren't about what's easy or safe, they're about what's right. As she prepared to rescue the 2 crash victims below, Sarah smiled. She was still wearing her red jacket, she was still flying rescue missions, and she was still the Red Falcon. But now she knew something she hadn't known before that day at Pine Ridge Camp. Sometimes risking everything is the only way to save everything that matters. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing, and Sarah grabbed her medical kit. 2 more people were about to be saved, and that was all that really mattered. The Red Falcon was back in action, and she was exactly where she belonged.